Hello and welcome once again. President Volodymyr Zelensky has denied allegations by Russia that Ukraine launched a drone attack on one of President Vladimir Putin's residences. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed Kiev had launched an attack overnight using 91 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles on Putin's state residence in Russia's northwestern Novgorod region. Russia says it will now review its position in peace negotiations. Zelensky dismissed the claim as typical Russian lies intended to give the Kremlin an excuse to continue attacks on Ukraine. He said that Russia had previously targeted government buildings in Kiev.
Брехня Російської Федерації. Зрозуміло, що вчора у нас була зустріч з Трампом. І зрозуміло, що для русських, якщо у нас з Америкою немає скандалу, а ми маємо прогрес, для них це провал. Зараз вони своєю заявою, що атакована була їх якась резиденція, просто готують, впевнений я, готують, в принципі, ґрунт для того, щоб нанести удари, напевно, по столиці і, напевно, по державним будівлям. Це вже у нас було. В вересні був ракетний удар по кабінету. Казала про те, що вони будуть підбирати відповідні цілі. Тобто погрожують. Я думаю, тут сьогодні, в принципі, президенту Трампу, його команді, європейцям, я вважаю, треба включитися і відповідно провести роботу з людьми, про яких ще вчора говорили, що вони дуже хочуть закінчити війну.
В ночь с 28 на 29 декабря 2025 года киевский режим предпринял террористическую атаку с использованием 91 ударного беспилотного летательного аппарата дальнего действия на государственную резиденцию президента Российской Федерации в Новгородской области. Все беспилотные летательные аппараты уничтожены средствами противовоздушной обороны Вооруженных сил Российской Федерации. Данных о пострадавших и ущербе от обломков БПЛА не поступало. Обращаем внимание на то, что данная акция была совершена в ходе интенсивных переговоров между Россией и США по урегулированию украинского конфликта. Подобные безрассудные действия не останутся без ответа. Объекты для ответных ударов.
The U.S. military carried out its third-tiered strike on a suspected drug smuggling boat in the eastern Pacific Ocean on Monday, killing 2 people, the Southern Command said. The strike is part of a campaign launched in early September, which has targeted narcotics operations at sea and resulted in at least 107 deaths. President Donald Trump has described the operations as an armed conflict with drug cartels intended to curb the flow of illicit drugs into the U.S. The operations have also coincided with increased U.S. military activity near Venezuela aimed at pressuring President Nicolas Maduro, whom Washington has charged with narco-terrorism.
Well, it doesn't matter, but there was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
Is that the only strike that the U.S. has done?
I don't want to comment on
it. President, have you or anyone in your administration talked to Maduro in recent days?
Well, I spoke to him.
Recently?
Pretty recent. Reasonably, but nothing much comes of it, yeah.
Mr. President, can you explain the importance
You have to understand what he's done. They've sent billions of dollars of drugs in. But maybe just as bad, they've sent hundreds of thousands of people in from jails, from prisons, from mental institutions and insane asylums. The drug lords, the drug dealers were all sent into our country. But think of it, what he's done. Tren de Aragua, probably the worst gang. They cut off people's fingers. One man made a phone call to complain about them. He cut off their hand. They cut off his hand. Don't ever make a phone call again. We'll cut off your other hand. After that, we'll kill you, they said. That was in Colorado. And now they sent in all of the bad ones. They sent in some bad people. And that to me was just terrible. And they send in drugs. Now, I will say this, 97% of the drugs coming in by sea stopped. We're trying to figure out who the other 3% are. They have a hard time getting people to pilot those boats. But 97% of the drugs coming in by the ocean, by the sea, by water, are gone. Every boat that we take out, we save 25,000 lives of Americans.
Are you going to ask Netanyahu to sign this agreement with Syria?
Well, I hope he's going to get along with Syria because the new president of Syria is working very hard to do a good job. He really is. I know he's a tough cookie, and he's, you're not going to get a choir boy to lead Syria. That's the one thing I will say. So I hope they're going to get along because, I dropped the sanctions on Syria because otherwise they wouldn't have had a chance. We want to see Syria survive. So we're going to be talking about Syria too. Okay?
Well, I'm joined now live from Vermont by RAI Special Correspondent James Blue. James, glad to have you joining me today. Well, Trump is berating Zelensky for drones targeted, according to Putin, at his residence. Zelensky says it's a lie, he calls it Russian lie, and no evidence supports this. The question is, why would Trump believe or cite Putin and then berate Zelensky for what Putin said that has no evidence supporting it?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I think one of the things that's happening is President Trump is trying to figure out how it is possible to get President Putin on board. And if it requires him to pretend that there has been a Ukrainian attack on one of Putin's residences, I think that is what President Trump and his team have decided they need to do. There is absolutely no proof that this attack happened. The Russians claim 91 drones were targeted towards Putin's residence on Sunday night into Monday morning. There's no satellite coverage of that. There's no sort of pictures of debris. There's absolutely nothing. And the other issue is if there were a strike and the Russians were able to actually repel the drones, it does confirm that the Russian defenses are actually working. I think what is happening is that Russia is refusing to give any proof. They're calling the request for evidence insane. I think what the Americans are trying to do are trying to figure out they are very close to something that the Ukrainians will agree to. They're trying to get the Russians close to something that they will agree to. And I think the whole issue is trying to figure out how to get the Russians on side. And if it means pretending and suggesting that this drone attack did happen, perhaps that is the price for the larger good of actually getting the peace deal done.
That kind of that's kind of making sense, but hoping that Putin will be sold on that. Zelensky is saying that what Putin is doing is to proffer an excuse, as it were, to then attack residents or such residences in Ukraine. What do you make of the comment coming out of Zelensky's mouth?
Yeah, I mean, Zelensky is calling it a complete fabrication. He thinks it's designed to undermine the peace talks that President Trump is actually having some success with. And I think you're right. What Zelensky sees this as is a ploy to allow Russia to continue its attacks on Ukrainian locations, attacks on Ukrainian cities. There was a very strong attack on Kiev just before Zelensky met with President Trump and the U.S. foreign policy team. So there is a tactical effort here. President Putin is trying to pummel Ukraine as hard as he can, trying to get Ukraine to submit to Russian demands. And I think President Zelensky feels as though the Americans may be falling into the Russian trap. What's very clear is that the Americans want this war over, and they want it over really as quickly as possible on practically any terms possible. As you may know, the U.S. has agreed to provide security guarantees for 15 years. President Zelensky was hoping for a commitment of 50 years. And so I think he is quite nervous that the Americans could cut and run. And so I think what he's trying to do is President Zelensky is trying to show and convince the Americans that the Russians aren't serious. But the problem with that is if Russians aren't serious and the Americans can't make them, certainly the Europeans won't be able to make the Russians do things. And so I think there's a real, the Americans feel Zelensky has no other choice. Take our boat that we're trying to put you in to get to the other side or potentially sink. And I think that's a really hard place for Zelensky to be. But I do believe that the Americans are quite clear this is the only boat that's going to come save you. It may not be a luxury yacht. It may not be exactly the sailboat you want, but this is the boat that we have. And I think what President Putin is doing is really trying to disable and to try to really make that boat as weak as possible so that Putin's hand remains strong after any peace deal.
I'm thinking this next question, what I, agrees with your first statement, the fact that Putin tells Trump in a phone call that he's interested in Ukraine's success. Trump believes him. Zelensky says that's not true. But really, to analysts and people who are watching, this is a no-brainer. Russia is saying it's interested in Ukraine's success. Is it the same kind of game that Trump is trying to play, pull wool over Russia's, over Putin's eyes?
Yeah, look, I think there is a bit of gamemanship here, and you're absolutely right to point it out. And President Putin is speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and he has found a very successful partner to do that with President Trump. I think the biggest concern that we all have about this ongoing negotiation is the way in which the United States has seemed very unwilling to pressure Russia. The sanctions are still quite mild. The lack of Tomahawk missiles are still sort of a demand that President Putin has made, and the U.S. has not gone around it. The way the U.S. has stopped funding a lot of the Ukrainian military effort is now being funded by the Europeans. And so there's a real mystery as to why President Trump has not stood up more to President Putin. I don't think this Ukraine war situation is going to necessarily get us to the solution for that or reveal what that's all about. But what I do think is that the Americans are saying to President Zelensky, you have a very narrow, small window. We want to stand and work with you to get this closed. And this is what you have to do. And I think as that time horizon shortens, I think Russia recognizes that there is leverage. And so they can create a red herring like a drone strike, which did not happen, as a way to sort of delay it, as a way to sort of throw water on it, and as a way to potentially upset the cart. The real question is, what is the tipping point for President Zelensky? At what point will he just say, we have to cave and we have to take this deal? We don't really know that yet, but certainly the Russians are trying to push him there. The Americans are trying to push him there as well. And I think President Zelensky is just feeling pressed on both sides. And clearly, the fake news of a drone strike doesn't help.
All right. I hope we have time. If we don't have time, the picture you were watching earlier on of President Donald Trump and Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, if we have time, we'll get to that. But this attack on a dock in Venezuela of boats that Trump says ferried drugs out of Venezuela. The nagging question is, what is Trump's end game here? I mean, it's been said that CIA was involved. In fact, let me read a quote from Trump for you. Asked if the CIA had carried out the attack, Trump said, a quote, "I don't want to say that I know exactly who it was, but I don't want to say who it was. And no report of," and again, that was Trump's statement. And then again, no report of this attack in Venezuela media. It's confusing. What do you make of all that? And like I asked, what's the end game? Regime change or not?
I don't think we know what the end game is. Certainly, instability in Venezuela will only send more Venezuelan refugees to the United States. And as you saw in the clip, President Trump really is against that and upset about the number of Venezuelans who've come here. We don't really know what the end game is. We do know that the U.S. has amassed the largest armada of ships and naval vessels in the Caribbean that have ever been there. So certainly they have planned for something. The strike on the Caracas port was a very, very big change. It was the first time on the ground covert forces, the US CIA, have actually done things that were sort of in public view. They blew up a port, which was sort of auxiliary port. It wasn't in the main area, but it was really just trying to show a sign of strength that the US can and actually do these things on the ground in Venezuela. I think the big mystery, and we just don't know, what did President Trump say to President Maduro when they actually had the conversation? I mean, this could all be something that they've choreographed and sort of have played out. Let's do this, and then after a certain point, you'll flee. We just don't know. The Venezuelan economy is reeling. The oil that they were using to get illegal funds, that is drying up. As President Trump said, people are very scared to pilot and drive these boats that are subject to being blown up by the Americans. And so there's a real kind of question as to what will this lead to. At the same time, there's a question about the legality of these actual US military actions. And the reality is the drug flow from this port, from Venezuela, is much, much smaller than the drug flow from the US southern border with Mexico or the drug flow of fentanyl from China. And so it's a bit of it's not that they've made it up, but it's a bit of a dilemma in need of a very convenient solution. The US has decided that the drugs from Venezuela are a big deal. We have to stop them. And as a result, they are mounting this military and covert operation. The question that we do not know and people have not been able to answer is, what is this leading to? As you know, the US has really said that the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well, which means the US wants to have sort of exclusive rights and responsibility for the Western Hemisphere. And so perhaps Venezuela, which is strongly allied with Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China, US, enemies for the most part, that this could be a place where the US is going to try to actually exert some additional power and strength and perhaps try for regime change. I think it's very, very unclear. And it's also not particularly aligned with the MAGA campaign pledge to sort of get out of foreign entanglements. And so it's very interesting to see this big push that by the US in an area that many of the Trump supporters were actually quite adamant that they wanted the US to be less involved overseas. So we don't know where it's going to go. I do know that if there are any U.S. casualties, if any U.S. service members or others are actually injured, that would sort of be a change of tone. And I think at that point, the Trump administration would have to admit exactly what they're trying to do, because at that point, the cost to U.S. lives will have been great. Losing, just one soldier is a problem. And so I think people will want to demand and want to know, where are we going? But at this point, we still have no clear idea the goal of this campaign.
All right, just very briefly before I let you go. So it was all about flattery between Trump and Netanyahu. What more can you tell us about that meeting?
Well, President Netanyahu went to the meeting yesterday really sort of being on the outs with the White House staff. They really are sick and tired of his delays, his unwillingness to deal with the Palestinians. What he got and what he found was a President Trump who really is embracing him, really sort of trying to suggest that there's no daylight between the US and Israel. Now, this may be because at the moment, the MAGA movement is really suffering and really at odds over an anti-Semitic sort of issues and challenges. A number of anti-Semites who have been part of the MAGA coalition are coming out much more vocally against Jewish people. And so some have suggested that this sort of time with President Netanyahu was a way to reassure American Jews. As you know, we have midterm elections coming up in November of 2026, and this could be part of that play. On the other hand, President Trump is really strong arming Arab countries and other countries, apparently Indonesia, Azerbaijan, some of the Gulf states, to actually go and sort of create that military that is supposed to patrol and sort of be on the ground in Gaza. The big problem at the moment: who is going to disarm Hamas? And they don't know that. Obviously, the Israeli Defense Force cannot do it. And, Hamas believes that they should be able to keep some weapons even in, this sort of interim stage. So it was a big surprise the extent to which President Trump and President Netanyahu had this love
All
fest.
right.
President Trump's going to get the Israel Prize, and it is a very, very unknown exactly where this is headed.
All right, thank you so much, James Rice, special correspondent all the way from Vermont. Thank you for being on the show.